Well, good afternoon. It's a delight to see each and every one. I'm told that you've been having a wonderful and fabulous day of remembering and recommitting to the ideals of justice, particularly those associated with Dr. King and those that modeled and mimicked his acts of great kindness and consideration and the rightness of humanity. Certainly, I want to say thank you to Mr. Kai Swanson, my friend, colleague. Now, he's being much more gracious than he ought to have been as it pertains to one thing that he did with the Human Rights Commission. I want you to know what a champion he has been for the years that he has served, what a networker bringing people together to have serious conversations about life and the oughtness of humanity. He has been an individual that has received me and so many others with open arms, willing to work alongside and push an agenda. So would you please help me to celebrate his work, not only at Augustana, but in the Rock Island community. Thank you. Of course, I would be remiss if I didn't thank President Bowles and his commitment as well for instituting and making sure this is a part of the fabric of education here at Augustana into the 3 symposia that you have. I'm glad to be a part of this one, the winter, a session that allows us to have discourse and dialogue, to kind of ponder out loud, think with a global perspective, but act locally. Now, I've just had a wonderful experience at the King Center with a guest speaker from Chicago with the Ceasefire Initiative, Ms. Amina Matthews, and she is one of the 3 individuals that were a part of the award-winning documentary, The Interrupters. She serves as a violence interrupter, and many of you are aware of the challenges, with all due respect to those who are on the ground working very hard to stop violence on the street there in Chicago. She took time away from her duties to come down and assist us today in our celebration. And so it would be a robbery of opportunity if I did not do the same. As we have been celebrating as the King Center, I wanted to be a part of this opportunity as well. So thank you again for your very warm and winsome welcome. I feel right at home with you. The African proverb suggests that he who walks fast walks alone. He who walks slow will always walk with friends. I have but an allotted amount of time, and so I'm going to ask that you would jog with me, that we can stay together so we can bring the big ship in right on time, and we trust that there'll be time for dialogue, question and answer, and then hopefully I'll see you afterward at the reception. I'm here to give some insights to the unfinished agenda of Dr. King, the building of the beloved community. Needless to say, at the outstart, that Dr. King's life is currently in vogue. Everybody's a friend of Dr. King now. But while he was living, he was one of the most polarizing individuals. As a matter of fact, in the last year of his life, they did a poll and 75% of Americans disagreed with him. 55% of the African American community disagreed with him. He was a man of stress and strain, a man that would speak over 460 times a year. For 13 years straight, what you don't know and what you don't see in the videos and his eloquence is that while he would sit sometimes, he would have nervous tics from the constant death threats, involuntary convulsions. He suffered from insomnia. He would have to be hospitalized because of pure exhaustion. That was the constant grind. Trying to make life better for others. Trying to build the beloved community. But now, today, in his death, as an iconic figure representing the ideals of democracy, his words are frequently quoted in television commercials and literature. His image is displayed wherever the cause of love and justice is paramount. The media, along with the Academy, highlights his service in so many roles. namely as civil rights leader, human rights activist, and organizer. But it is essential to understand what King considered himself to be. King was, before and all, a preacher. Therefore, his understanding and articulation of what we call the beloved community is directly derived from his understanding of the gospel of Jesus Christ, predominantly, although not exclusively, and I argue from the Gospel of Luke. Dr. King preached so often from that gospel. You will remember some of his most noted sermons, where he highlights the poor, the outcasts, women, the infirm, and the exploited. King's entire adult life was a response to the gospel that led him to declare, before I was a civil rights leader, I was a preacher of the gospel. This was my first and still remains my greatest commitment. You know, all that I do in civil rights, I do because I consider it a part of my ministry. I have no other ambitions in life but to achieve excellence in the Christian ministry, end quote. I make mention of this fact for two reasons. First and foremost, to promote the understanding that the ministry of King, or the service of King, albeit agile and adaptive in geographical terms, was rigidly cemented in the role of a preacher. Second, Dr. King emphatically states his primary goal is to preach the gospel, and through operating in many roles, as he did, he chose not to abandon the call to preach or to serve a local congregation. All of his globetrotting did not take him away from his call as a pastor. He will always maintain a pulpit. And then later, when he could not, because of the burdens and responsibilities at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church there in Montgomery, in the pull of the civil rights movement, he became a co-pastor with his father at famous Ebenezer Baptist Church there in Atlanta. But he always maintained his commitment to a local congregation. Therefore, it is with the words of Dr. King in mind that I propose an analysis which is primarily concerned with his service as a preacher that faithfully served across larger platforms in life. It is my contention that many, with laudable intention, have labeled King in their study as primarily an activist with political goals of justice and democracy. They fail to understand him as an agile preacher and are not able to trace his ideals of justice and love appropriately back to his theology. An appropriate view of King's theological themes will provide an insight to his understanding of salvation, which I argue is the ultimate goal and the bounty of the beloved community. To fully understand King's beloved community is to investigate his speeches and writings for his Christian undertones, and because King was a preacher, it best serves us to draw special attention to his sermons, his speeches, and his actions. And sometimes he interweaves into his sermons so much of the democracy principles and so much into his speeches theology that it's hard to tell whether he's giving a speech or a sermon at times. I'm in agreement with the theologian James Cone, who suggests what King really thought about God is not found in the essays or even his PhD dissertation he wrote in graduate school, and is not found even in some of his published essays and books about civil rights movements. But one discovers King's faith primarily in his preached word, chiefly the unpublished sermons delivered at Dexter Avenue and Ebenezer and other black churches, and his practice word during many of his nonviolent direct action demonstrations, mainly in the South. End quote. Cone's analysis highlights King as fundamentally a man of faith, committed to his God and to church. King proclaimed salvation to two audiences, the sacred and the secular. King's works bridged the secular and sacred audiences with nominal separation between them at times, because his faith was at the core of his proclamation. One should consider the genius of his belief system. Therefore, the beloved community is a unique expression of public theology that expresses the ideal and divine oughtness working through the present isness of our reality. Thus, the beloved community embodies a relative democratic vision, a strong social analysis, courageous acts of resistance or emancipation, and restorative acts of reconciliation. For the beloved community fights for full citizenship through the principles of our democracy. It unites in seamless motion the theology founded upon the words of the prophets, the apostles, and of course Jesus, with the words of the framers of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. the beloved community was concerned about saving America, in the sense that she would be saved from the sin and shame of injustice and hatred. In fact, the slogan, and many people don't know this, of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was to save the soul of America. The beloved community evolves from the notion that certain biblical principles of justice are shared in democratic ideals. It is in the sharing of ideals that religious warrants can be introduced into public argument in a way compatible with the fundamental values of democracy, congenial to the diversity of political and moral positions, and comfortable to basic standards of publicity. In addition to the democratic vision, public theology provides a social analysis. Because King was a member of the Society of the Oppressed, his articulation of the lived experiences is especially noteworthy. In King's letter from the Birmingham jail, he crafts a compelling argument in response to a group of white clergy who urged Dr. King to slow down the movement. The social analysis in his acknowledgement of power and the powerless. The analysis is what the public theologian uses to confront the injustice in society. Without a stark and real depiction of the state of being in society, both the sacred and secular will be reluctant to engage in any meaningful action. King's work to establish the beloved community reveals two primary methods that he utilized in resistance. First of all, the prophetic voice and nonviolent direct action. The prophetic voice for King was the mandate to transmit the desires of God and a process of revealing the sins of the nation. The revelation of sin promotes repentance, which is a complete abandonment of oppressive and exploitive actions, both personally and through our public policy. In the Kingian lens, true repentance, even beyond religious frameworks, only occurs when we own the offenses of our society. Building the beloved community is not concerned with placing blame, but only in transforming humanity. Holding the nation accountable enables people to choose the rightness of justice by responding with affirmative actions, which grants possibility of what we all desire, reconciliation. So we're here today remembering Dr. King and that work that is yet to be finished. See, building the beloved community requires that we merge our great boldness with our great tact. We must blend unique courage with uncommon sternness and severity. And when we witness the suffering of poor people, the despised and the rejected, the mentally ill, the homeless, the returning citizens from prison, we have a responsibility to be an interruption to that stride of injustice. I'd like to leave you with a few points here. The first is that building the beloved community requires righteous indignation to interrupt that stride of injustice. And if things are going to change as we desire, we're going to have to speak up and stand up. Dr. King was right when he said there comes a time when one must take the position that is neither safe, nor politic, nor popular. But he must do it because his conscience tells him it is right. He would all go on to say so often that the world is being destroyed, not so much by the vitriolic words of bad people as much by the appalling silence of good people. And oh, how we miss this kind of dynamism. His vigor, his voice, his declarative acts of racial and radical revolutionary tactics, full of righteous indignation and moral courage, yet yielding no weapon in rage, only strikes of love, knowing that justice for all is more than just a quick quip or quote. It was a principle that he lived for, and it was a principle that he died for. We're missing this kind of driving force that demands our action, this kind of anger, not at people, but at injustice. We have come to accept injustice as it has become an irritable house guest that has stayed too long. And we try to avoid this unacceptable intruder into our house. But we must stand and declare immediate eviction. We must at times ruffle some feathers. At times we must rock some boats. At times we must let the tension get high. At times we must get on some people's nerves. At times we must be willing to be labeled a troublemaker. But at the end of the day, injustice must go. You know, one person stood and famed abolitionist Harriet Tubman was giving a speech. And the gentleman, and I use that term loosely, walked up to her afterward and said, I have about as much patience with you as that of a biting gnat. And then she would say to him, well, one thing about it, it keeps on biting. Her courage to be that nipping flea, she is still my hero. Dr. King was labeled a rabble-rouser. Nelson Mandela was labeled a traitor, a communist, an enemy of the state. And now we call him Mr. President. And now we call him great humanitarian. Now we call him the great peacemaker. Because the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. But it only bends by the constant leaning of men and women who are fed up through and through and angry at injustice. St. Thomas Aquinas wrote on the subject of anger, and I quote, "He that is angry without cause shall be in danger. But he that is angry with cause shall not be in danger. For without anger, teaching will be useless, judgments unstable, crime unchecked." And he concludes by stating, to be angry is not always an evil. You see, the beloved community cannot be established through some nettlesome negotiations with injustice. It is brought into existence through a deep disdain with systems that drain, diminish, and deplete the human personality. So we start with this idea of righteous indignation. The next one that I would like to leave with you is that we must address in new ways the present-day triple evils of racial discrimination, social degradation, and economic exploitation. And there are a few things that I know Dr. King would be working extremely hard on had he lived beyond that April 4th, 1968 evening. And the first one that I know he would be working on is mass incarceration in the prison industrial complex. Mass incarceration hinders the beloved community. When we have over 2.2 million people incarcerated, and over half of that population, close to half now, male and black, there is something sinister and wrong in our humanity. You see, 30 years ago, only 300,000 people were incarcerated. Now we swell to over 2 million. We did not get here overnight. It is systematic. It is sinister. History reveals that in 1973, the National Advisory Commission on Criminal Justice Standards and Goals issued a recommendation that no new institutions for adults should be built and existing institutions for juveniles should be closed. And then in 1982, President Ronald Reagan initiated the war on drugs, and it was launched at a time when drug crime was on the decline. As a matter of fact, only 2% of the population even stated and posed that drugs were a major issue in society. And so now we see the balloon of a system that takes. We know that there are some direct correlations between the lack of education, particularly that in poor communities, that creates a pipeline all the way to narrow jail cells. We also know that politically, jail cells and prisons have become expedient. New prisons are being built primarily in white rural towns. And then they count the men and women as a part of the census. So these prisons are going there, and they are economic generators. They get more dollars for infrastructure. They're counted for electoral college, and regions get extra points for presidential elections. Cities interested in community economic development grants consider them in their proposals. Everybody's benefiting off of someone else's challenge. The economic exploitation. Right now, 500,000 people in America work as prison guards. Most of them and the new institutions are built, of course, in areas that are not representative of the population that they are sending there. Did you know that in Illinois, right now, there are some prisons that charge $15 a minute for a collect phone call? These institutions are in cahoots with one another. They get the kickback. They're profiteering off of the pain of somebody else. And statistics reveal that when you have the meaningful relationships through phone calls and letters that those who are incarcerated fare better. They do better. They're able to try to put their life together and finish their rehabilitative walk behind bars until they get out. So not only are those phone calls $15 a minute, but then there are institutions that are privatizing prisons. Corrections Corporation of America, they're on their road to privatizing all the prisons in America. They contacted 48 states, essentially soliciting to run those prisons for up to 20 years. And it sounds like a great job. They said, wow, these people are so generous, they want to come in and show us how to run prisons more effectively and efficiently. Here's the challenge, ladies and gentlemen, that when they go into those states, this is what they ask for. We'll run them for 20 years. But you have to guarantee us 90% occupancy. How do you guarantee 90% occupancy? How do you guarantee for 20 years you'll hold the numbers at 90%? I long for the day when we take the profit out of prisons. I have yet to see a prison closed in my lifetime due to a lack of occupancy. As a matter of fact, when they build the new one, before that paint dries on that last sale, it's already filled. The overcrowding of prisons is always a reality. I have yet to see a prison wing closed and remodeled for education and training. I have yet to see these things happen in my lifetime. And then not to mention the social degradation that comes along with the scarlet letter of being a felon. Did you know that once you're labeled a felon, one is deprived of public housing? One faces discrimination in employment, legally, denied voting rights, and you know what that means in so many states. They can't even vote. And they are there and they're told that when you come out, we want you to return back to full citizenship. We want you to become, sir, ma'am, a member of productive citizenry. We want you to go get a job. But yet, once you get a job, you pay taxes, and yet you cannot vote for your representation. And I'm sorry to say that we cannot accept this, because that is taxation without representation, and we pour tea out in Boston because of that. How are you going to demand a person work and pay taxes and cannot vote for representation? That is how sinister it is. It's second-class citizenship. You know, once you have a felon, you can be denied food stamps. You cannot even eat. Public benefits, educational benefits, and excluded from serving on a jury. What we have essentially is this sense of perpetual sentencing, where one who has not only endured being locked up, but now must suffer the indignity of being locked out, which is even far more harsh. So from emancipation, the stereotype was that they were too ignorant to control themselves, too prone to violence to be free, too irresponsible to be pure and virtuous. So one thing's for sure, that whatever you and I fear, we will not seek to understand, we will seek to control and to confine. Whether we want them to or not, over 650,000 are returning from prison a year. And the question is, what will we see when they return? Will we see them as societal scrap, or a person with value and human personality and the potential for greatness? I love what Waldo Rolf Emerson says. People see what they are prepared to see. And far too many of us in America are not prepared to see them returning as a part of humanity. I'm not talking about something I've just researched. I'm talking about something I know up close. My most recent post was in Omaha, Nebraska. And there we led the state's largest reentry employment initiative for men and women coming out of prison. I saw up close. I heard their stories. I've seen their repentance. I've seen the turn in their life. But every time, some of them that were ready to move forward, because not all were ready, but those that were ready to move forward, tried to move forward, they were met with scorn and contempt. People would ask me always, Reverend, you work with those people that have hurt others. And I said, yes. You've worked with some that have shot others. I said, yes. You've worked with some who have raped others. Yes. You've worked with some who have injured others for life. Yeah, I do. And they wanted me to make excuse for it, and I wouldn't make apology for it. Because you need me to work with them. You want me to work with them. Because that 70% recidivism rate says that if they go back, they're not going back because they were always nice. If they go back, that means they have offended society again. And here's my understanding of it. Some of their offenses turned my stomach. Some of their offenses had me almost breaking out in a hive. But I still believe redemption is possible. I still believe that a person can change. And if I don't believe that as a minister, who will? Here's what I know. I never worry about those who I have a record on. I never worry about those where they send me a facsimile or they hand deliver a concealed package with all of their offenses. Because I know their offenses, and I can watch out for their offenses, and I can protect my community because I know their offenses. I worry about the offenses of those who wear Brooks Brothers suits, who shake hands every day, who we give awards to, who jump on planes that are private and fly over to Thailand and have their way with 12 and 13-year-old girls. I worry about the people who systematically take retirement funds from hardworking folks. I worry about the people that go back into their community, whether it's a gated community or a posh landscape, and choke the life out of a woman in their house, or kick their children, or starve them and lock them in rooms. I worry about the people who I don't have a record on, not the ones I know about. Our commitment is to be prepared to be able to deal with all humanity and never put people in a box so that they cannot become something different than their offense. And building the beloved community requires that we seek to end the root causes of poverty and create opportunity. Dr. King gave his life not integrating a lunch counter in Memphis. He gave his life that April 4th evening, standing there at the Lorraine Motel on that second floor balcony. He gave his life there, standing alongside the working poor. He gave his life there, standing along those that worked an enormity of hours and couldn't make ends meet. He gave his life there, willing to stand with people that were doing their best to take care of the necessities of this life. And he was struck down by an assassin's bullet. And so I know if he was alive today, he would have his finger on the pulse of poverty and opportunity. I believe the conversation about poverty in America is too truncated, so narrow, so racialized. While blacks do not make up the majority of the nation's poor, however, the majority of blacks and people of color are poor at times. And because of constant media attacks, and you know where this has its roots, you remember that movie, Don't Go Out and Rent It or Pull It Up. But you know of that D.W. Griffith's work of Birth of a Nation that promoted the Klan and White Citizens Council as the heroes of society, and everyone that was black, pejorative and profane. And it led and promoted a birth of Red Summer, lynchings that went across America because someone else sought to define another through the media. We're not too far removed from that. You remember the 2012 elections? You remember Congresswoman Michelle Bachmann, you remember? She had a comment about the poor. And I don't do this to injure her. I do this so that we can get a basic understanding of what we think about poor people. She says in a very cavalier way, I used to be poor. And you know what I did? I went out and got a job. Wow, that's all you had to do. Really? That's all you have to just go out and get a job and you will be no more poor. You remember Rick Santorum. And this is what he said. This is what I mean by the racialization of poverty. I don't want to make black people's lives better by giving them other people's money. Mr. Santorum, I don't want other people's money. This is how people understand poor. Newt Gingrich, and he says this is what he would do. They ask him a question, how would you help the demographic of black people and what would you do to garnish their support and vote? He says, I would tell black people to demand paychecks instead of food stamps. Really, that's what you think black people demand? Food stamps? Obviously. It would be wrong for me to think that they don't know the reality and the statistics. They do. They're much more intelligent. Obviously, he knows 1 out of 6 people in America receive food stamps. Obviously, he knows they're both urban and rural. Obviously, he knows they're both white and black, brown, and everything in between. Obviously, he knows this. But it's those kind of perpetuations that get into the media and get carried on and passed on. And the myth and the lie is told so often that we end up believing that. And it becomes something cemented in stone. This is purposeful intent. And you say, well, Reverend, you seem like a conspiracy theorist. No, I'm not saying that. I don't always believe there's some people in the back room saying, how can we keep black folk down? I will say this, though. It wasn't a slip of the pen that wrote us in as 3/5 of a person. And whether you want to argue or not, whether it is deliberate intent, this is what I have to say. You cannot deny that it is disparate impact. Whether you want to say it's deliberate intent, look at the end result. It is disparate impact. And this is the reality. And I believe Dr. King would not only deal with the framing of poverty, but I think he would deal with the psychological poverty that is happening so often, which is unattainable, unacceptable, and unconscionable. To have so many schools failing. Many members of the school board are my friends. I have served with them from years. They're my colleagues. Many of the principals, many of the teachers, the administrators. But do you know that in our beloved city, my dear city, at Rock Island School District 41, Rock Island Minor School District 41, 12 out of the 13 schools are failing. Did you know that? Did you know that right around the corner from the King Center, the school that I care for and have served in, the Rock Island Academy, did you know they're 18 from the bottom in the state? Did you know that? Did you know that we just received a school improvement grant? Did you know? $6.2 million. Did you know we didn't get that because we were shooting the stars. We got that because we're failing in our education. And it would be easy to blame the teachers. It would be easy to blame the administrators. It would be easy to point fingers at the school board. It would be easy to say parents are not doing their job. It would be easy to look at the students and say, you know what? You're not performing and you could do better. You should be taking more time to study. Turn off the social media. Turn off the television. But when are we going to have a mature dialogue? A sincere conversation. Not about pointing fingers, but saying collectively that this is unacceptable and get to work to fix it. Because I'm tired of seeing kids a little younger than my baby brother and my younger sister, carted off with orange jumpsuits and flip-flops on. I'm tired of standing over short caskets. Not because they were only 5'2". I'm saying short because they only lived to be 19 years old. The breath of life cut off too soon. And if we don't fix education, what will a person have? Malcolm X was right when he said that education is our passport for the future, to the future. It is our escalator. It is our wonderful opportunity. And then we have to talk about the sociologically poor folks. Won't stay here long, but you know there's so many people without meaningful relationships? You know that? With all of our social media and all of our, I think is it tweeting? With all of our engagements, and you wake up, the first thing we do is that we reach for the cell phone to find out who's talking to us and who's made a Facebook update. And we walk around with 1,000 Facebook friends and no meaningful relationship. 1,000 Facebook friends and no one to talk to. Who do you really talk to? See, Dr. King gave his life for reconciliation, for the broken community to come together, that we don't have enough meaningful relationships. That's why, unfortunately, so many young people are taking their own life. They feel no one is there for them. That's why so many people feel alienated. And I'll share this with you. I was at a barber shop, and I had returned back to the city. A young man came in, his pants were sagging, his coat, extra large, and his beard was matted, and his hair wasn't together. I recognized him when we went to school together. He pulled me to the side. He didn't want his friends to hear what he had to say, but he wanted to talk to me. We sat side by side, eyeball to eyeball, nose to nose almost, as he whispered to me. He said, "I'm so glad you're back. I don't know why you went the direction you went to. I don't know why I did some of the things I did, but I'm so glad you're back. I read your story in the paper." And he says that I wanted to talk to you. I want to ask you to do something for me. And I said, "What's that? Just tell me." He said, "Just make me a promise." And I said, "Help me to understand." Make me a promise that no matter what you do, whether you stay here or not, whether you make mistakes or not, you don't even have to be perfect. He said, "Make me a promise." And I said, "Help me to understand." He said, "Make me a promise that you won't forget us." He said, "Just don't forget about us." He says, "No one thinks about us. No one cares whether we live or die." He said, "No one appreciates who we are." He says, "You don't even have to do it for us." He said, and this is his language, he said, "Just throw the past in our direction." He said, we'll run out and try to get under it. Just let us know you're thinking about us." And I think in the memory of Dr. King, he would challenge us not to forget the poor. In our moving through life and society, I know he would challenge us. Don't forget about those that are sociologically impoverished without any meaningful relationships. And then, of course, we have to talk about financial poverty. Financial poverty helps us to understand that there are far too many people relegated to the socioeconomic basement of our house. They are the generationally poor. That means the chronic poor. Their heads hang low because of the low ceilings of opportunity. Their outlook for the future is diminished, for there are no full windows to inspire their vision. They only have the porthole views to watch society walk briskly past them. Their faces never receive the growth-inspiring kiss of sunlight because of their sub-level dwelling. Their only hope, and they have it dissipated in dreams dashed so often, as they hear the celebration of life upstairs to the music and whimsical dance, fostered by financial security and opportunity that others have fostered. They are the generationally poor. There are people right here in this city and beyond that if we look at their last names, their fathers and mothers were poor. Their grandmothers and grandfathers were poor. Their great-grandfathers and great-grandmothers are poor. They're perhaps the least educated, least work experience. How do we help that generation of people to break the cycle? And then there's the crisis poor, the episodic poor. These are individuals that normally fare pretty well in society. As a matter of fact, they may not be able to go to Disney World or Disneyland every year, but they could go to Great America, or they could run to Adventureland in the morning. They could pack up a nice bag of food and maybe get one hotel room out of it, or make it a day trip. These are everyday working people. And then something happens, the plant closes. Matter of fact, they give them a slip, or they tell them that we are going through a right-sizing of the company. And so whether you call it right-sizing, downsizing, they are sized right out of gainful employment. And they take that cardboard box, they pull the pictures off of their cubicles. They make that long walk down that hallway or across the plant floor into that parking lot. And that's it. And they have to start all over. But do you know the number one reason people catapult themselves down into, rather people are catapulted down into poverty as it pertains to episodic? The one right before the number one is divorce. And women and children immediately go back into that category or fall into that category. The number one reason is health care or health crisis. Did you know that? And so while we argue about almost at that time, a couple of years ago, almost 50 million people without health care at a level that would take care of their families. We argue about, okay, you don't like the bill that is currently out there in the law now, rather, that is instituted on the books. Let's fix it, let's make it work better, but let's not pretend this wasn't a challenge. And I'll tell you this, I don't know about you, and here's a moment of confession for me, but I'll gladly let them foreclose on my house. I'll gladly let them repossess my car. I'll gladly receive the phone calls about my delinquent payments. If I was trying to keep my loved one, my father, my mother, my child here another year, and I thought that chemotherapy or that operation would keep them one more year, I'll gladly go into poverty, I'll gladly go into debt, and I'll figure it out once I get there. And that is most of America that has slid down that slope into poverty because of a health crisis. The episodic poor. And we got to have a solution for this. And then there's the working poor. These are individuals that are working overtime, in between the time, beside the time, trying to find a little bit more time to try to make ends meet. These are individuals that work 40, 50, 60 hours a week. And people have the nerve to call them lazy because they're poor. And every day they muster more courage to begin the morning in miserable lack, and they will end it in a day of abject scarcity. That's what I mean by courage. They start out, they walk out the door knowing that there's not enough, and they work a full day plus some, knowing that they'll come back home to not enough. The census numbers suggest that there are 49.4 million people living below the federal poverty level. And you know what that number is? Federal poverty level. $23,050 for a family of four. And people think that because they get a few food stamps, that the poor is bankrupting America because, after all, $23,050 is a lot of money. $23,050 for a family of four. 16 million children living right here in America in poverty. Half of America living at 200% of the federal poverty level. Half of America lives at 200% of the federal poverty level. That's about, for a family of four, $45,000. We have to find a way to make sure livable wage, jobs and employment opportunities with the security of benefits are there for all those that are willing to work and ready for the opportunities. And then finally, politics and voting rights. Dr. King would have been working on this today. Justice Marshall warns us that history teaches that great threats to liberty often comes in times of urgency, when constitutional rights seem too extravagant to endure. We must exercise our own power in politics if we're going to follow after Dr. King. For politics is the process in which we, the people who live in a democracy, translate what we believe into public policy and practice. It is the process that determines who gets how much, when, where, of income, education, health care, housing, and justice. And this is what the beloved community is all about. Because we must now decide what kind of people we will be and whether we are going to settle for less. What will be our legacy? Now, as the clock of destiny ticks, and the hand of the hourglass of opportunity continues to drain. We must decide how will we display our embedded and intrinsic power as we prepare a world to see people who refuse to pretend that we do not see injustice, that we are not only frustrated, but we're ready for action. Building the beloved community requires that we possess the power of mind to say that we are not the property of any political party, with all due respect for the representatives thereof. For no political party, in and of itself, has been a paragon of political virtue or a juggernaut of social justice. Morality does not stampede in on the backs of elephants, nor does it stroll in on the backs of donkeys. It is not robed in red, and it is not baptized in blue. Moral actions are the result of men and women who have a God conscience, entering into voting booths, city hall, council chambers, governor seats, state legislatures, the Congress, the House, Senate, to remember to love mercy, do justice, and walk humbly with their God. In the days ahead, we must not cower and consider it to be unpatriotic to raise questions about our national character and our local politicians. You know, sometimes you raise questions and people charge you with being an individual that is unpatriotic. I'm third generation combat veteran. I welcome those questions. I welcome the questions about why do I say what I have to say? Because my grandfather, World War II, Purple Heart, my father, Vietnam, and myself, both World War I. We put it all out there on the line. So if I can't raise a question, what country do I live in? Therefore, we vote not only our interests, but our principles, and principles that reflect our commitments. Therefore, we are never wrong to question why our communities of color littered with check cashing, payday loan centers, rent-to-own centers, liquor stores almost on every block, and we barely can find a dry cleaner, a coffee shop, major chain grocery store, and a major employer that is not a nonprofit. In my community, the one I serve in, drive through there, you'll see gas stations. Better yet, they're liquor stores posed as gas stations. They sell about 5 gallons of gas a day and 500 gallons of liquor. Check behind the counter and see the abundance of Swisher Sweets, those cigars, that people empty out and pack with marijuana. And that's the only reason why they have them on their counters, because in my community there are few Cuban cigar clubs. They wouldn't do that in any other community. They wouldn't be able to set up shop there with 90% of their window covered with liquor signs that our kids got to walk past, can't even see them. Call themselves convenience stores. And the only thing they advertise is toxins and cigarettes and liquor, hard liquor. I'm not talking about a six-pack, I'm talking about liquor. The cheap kind, the Thunderbird, the Mad Dogs, that have people stumbling out in the street. And many of these individuals that own these shops live nowhere in our community, and they never see the hand that smashes against the face of a woman. They never see the car run off side of the road. And frankly, they don't care. You stumble over the displays for liquor when you go in, and our kids try to go buy a bag of chips. And they got to walk past that every day. The empty lots and the decaying buildings. This is what Dr. King would be challenging us to do. To mobilize within, then look for great partnerships to make it a reality. That's what the beloved community is all about. It's not about me trying to impose my understanding of morality upon another individual, because people in affluent communities, they drink too. But they buy their liquor in spirits from established places of business located in major chain operations, not on some corner that takes advantage of a community. When's the last time you saw a payday loan center close? 300% interest rate. When's the last time you saw cash for titles close? And when you're 1 minute late, they got your title. When's the last time you saw a pawn shop close? They don't, and they located in the poorest communities. And if there was no money in those communities, then how do they survive? Better yet, how do they keep thriving? These are the questions we must continue to ask. So we must never fear that we're wrong to ask why stop and frisk overwhelmingly happens in our community. And there's nothing more than blue uniformed intimidation tactics. Why is it a crime to drive while black? Why is it a crime to shop while black? Why is it in the case of Trayvon Martin and Oscar Grant and so many others, a case that is simply walking while black? And I don't know what they're going to think of next. What is it to be a crime breathing while black? That tells me that it's never about what we sincerely do at times. It's about people's understanding of who we are. Frederick Douglass says it this way in 1853. A heavy and cruel hand has been laid upon us. As a people, we feel ourselves to not only be deeply injured, but grossly misunderstood. Our white countrymen do not know us. They are strangers to our character, ignorant of our capacity, oblivious to our history and progress, and are misinformed as to the principles and ideas that control and guide us as a people. The great mass of American citizens estimate us as being a characterless and a purposeless people. And hence we hold up our heads, if at all, against the withering influence of a nation's scorn and contempt. That tells me that the offense is not only in action, but it is in a person's being. And we say we live in a post-racial era. After all, you have President Barack Obama. We say we live in a colorblind society. I would say this. My sincere hope is that we become post-racist. My sincere hope is that we become people not who are colorblind, but can see color and not hold color against the human that you're seeing. That is our commitment. And so now we find ourselves having the tough question of what will we do? For if we leave out of here today without giving ourselves some understanding of what we can do, then we've missed the moment. I love what Iago in Shakespeare's Othello had to say. Who steals my purse steals trash, 'tis something, nothing, 'twas mine, 'tis his, and has been the slave of thousands. But he who flashes from me my good name robs me of that which not enriches him and makes me poor indeed. You see, brothers and sisters, we are under the threat of being robbed of our good name by our indifference, our complacency, and our unwillingness to get involved in that which will indeed make us rich. Rich in humanity, rich in redemption, rich in reconciliation. So everyone must find their place and post as we declare that we are building the beloved community. The first thing that I suggest that we can do, and I'll move through these, maybe you want to take a few of these down, is that we must practice intentional location. That Dr. King purposely, in 1966, moved his entire family to the south side of Chicago. He didn't just come in and do a speech. He moved his family to the south side of Chicago in the projects. Moved them in that sweltering hot tenement building with his entire family, his 4 children. Now, I'm not asking you to do something as that level of commitments may require. But I would say this to you, as bright and as intelligent and gifted and the emerging leaders that you are, don't spend all your time on this campus. It would be a robbery of opportunity if you did not practice intentional location, going to some of the communities and finding your place among the people, with the people who you are studying, you are laboring to make their lives better. That is what intentional location is all about. The next, commit to writing at least one letter to your elected officials concerning your interests. Now, this is more than a New Year's resolution. Do that. Because they don't pay attention to a lot of talk. But if you write a letter, if you back it with some of your understandings, if you declare in your own way your interests, they will pay attention. And if you get a few others to write letters with you, don't have everybody sign the letter at the bottom. Each of you do a letter by yourself. There's no use of getting 2 pieces of paper and putting 200 signatures on it. Don't do that. Write 200 letters. And when they get at the office, the mail carrier will come in and they'll see a stack this big, saying similarly the same thing in your own voices. Practice that. The third, commit to working in voter education, registration, and participation drives and initiatives. Do that. In your own way, get involved. If it's forwarding on the email blast or participating in social media, showing up on location, inviting them to come here and talk to your student groups or the student body, get engaged to the point where you want to know the issues, that you want to know what their platforms are. The fourth, learn to balance your theoretical why with a practical how. You have to balance your theoretical why with a practical how. If all we do is think about it, which is important, we start there, but it doesn't end there. We have to balance our commitments with a practical how. How do we engage? How do we do it? The fifth, work to establish learning and training centers inside youth detention centers and adult prisons. You say, that's a big one, man. Well, there are juvenile boot camps that are close. Could you work a curriculum inside? There are institutions, juvenile detention centers. Could a group of you go there and organize yourself in saying that we want to ensure that we can help to broaden the perspectives of learning for those young people who are currently inside? That's what I mean by being creative and being a nonconformist and just going along with the trend. They're there, they're waiting on us. You'd be surprised how many are waiting to receive your help and your concern. Number 6, advocate for returning citizens and restorative rights. Now this one takes a little courage, because sometimes we feel that if we help someone who has been formally convicted, then our names will be marred. You know how easy it is to get a felony? You know, it doesn't take a lot of work. Do you know, even now, with the level of challenge with the mass incarceration, that there are over 3,200 people right now serving life without parole for a nonviolent offense? Some of them, their third strike happened when they stole a $135 coat. In America. Life, without parole, for 3 nonviolent felony accounts. This is why we must have the laws changed. Number 7, work to end the draconian drug laws that favor the rich and persecute the poor. You know, sometimes it's not what you do, it's how large your bank account is after you've done it. I've always said capital punishment is reserved for those that don't have capital. We got to make sure that the laws are fair. President Obama and his administration, they're working hard. Not fast enough. They're working hard. Used to be that you had 5 years mandatory sentencing for crack cocaine, and believe me, I'm not waving a flag over those that have sold cocaine or crack cocaine. What I'm saying though, if you could get 5 years for 5 grams, and that is 2 to 3 sweetened low packs of sugar, 5 years mandatory. It could be beyond that. And you could get probation for 500 grams of powder cocaine. The difference is that 95% of the people being convicted of crack cocaine were black and brown. And those that were convicted with powder cocaine were 95% white. There's something wrong with the system. Number 8, attend school board meetings and demand to see the statistics and the measurements of progress. You want to know how wide that gap is? What can we do to help fix it? You don't necessarily have to go in there looking for horns on a person or see if they're carrying a pitchfork, that there's sulfur and ash that follows every footstep. That's not what we're doing. But we need to know how we're going to make progress, and that tells me that we need to know where we currently stand. Number 9, attend council meetings, town hall meetings, and hold your elected officials accountable. And that is self-explanatory. Number 10, trace and track the money for programs for the poor, the grants that are received. We want to make sure the money gets to where it is needed the most. Historian Lerone Bennett said it this way: the irony of our situation is the poor making many rich, and we got to stop it. So we have to bear the burden of building the beloved community, and we're going to have to do it together. Without pride, without our superimposing egos, without our narcissism or self-aggrandizement, we're going to have to keep bringing people together. We must bring them in with business suits and from corner offices. We must bring them in with sagging jeans from street corners. We must bring them in from posh, manicured, gated communities, from debris-filled and deteriorating projects, people with PhDs and those with no D at all. Let us respect all but fear none. Let us never seek consensus, but let us strive to create it. Let politicians seek our advice. Let business leaders desire our partnership. Let youth crave our mentorship. Let the outcast desire our friendship. Let the educators seek our theory and activists our strategy. The work that we have to do of building the beloved community. We must gather the rich and the poor, the educated and the dropout, the notable and the common, those from various backdrops of ethnicity and race, for we are still cut from the same cloth. We are cut from a piece of the continent and a part of the main. We must never allow our status and access to power and position to separate us from the masses of those who dwell in the socioeconomic basement of the American dream. We must model what the prophet Ezekiel demonstrated, for he sat where they sat. We must go to the corner, to the projects, to the failing schools, to the jails, the detention centers, hospitals, mental illness wards, support groups, and recovery clinics. Let us build with the faith that Browning describes, one who never turned his back but marched abreast forward, never doubted the clouds would break, never dreamed though right worst, wrong would triumph, held we fall to rise, are baffled to fight better, sleep to wake. We must leave out today declaring that we should not be moved from recommitting ourselves to justice, for it is justice that paves the way for freedom and equality to travel. Justice is love dressed up in work clothes. So we must act afresh and anew, and we must act now. For now is the accepted time, not tomorrow, not some convenient season. For we must work while it is day, for night comes and no man can work. We must work until the low are lifted, until the outcast are welcomed, until the lonely are comforted, till the dreams are no longer deferred. We must work until every child born in the socioeconomic basement of today can reside on the balcony of tomorrow's opportunity. We must work until voting rights are no longer threatened, until politicians realize that budgets are much more than facts and figures and forecasts, but they are moral documents that all life is to be considered valuable and worthy of investment. We must work until justice indeed rolls down like waters. So let justice roll, until men and women returning from prison are no longer seen as social trash, but we see in them human treasure. Let justice roll until graduation rates of black and poor kids excel the average. Let justice roll until we get politicians who will no longer make mockery of the obligation to serve all people in all neighborhoods. Let justice roll until the legacy of white supremacy is washed away in affirmative acts of redress and policies of remedy. Let justice roll until the last becomes first and first becomes last, until the decaying communities become havens of hope, until we organize our efforts, mobilize our people, exercise our power, until love is common, until peace prevails, until all life is valued, until we make of this old world something new by building the beloved community. Have a great day today.